All right, thanks for tuning in here on Facebook Live. My name is James Long. I am the owner and founder of Regnum Legacy, which is an estate planning firm in Ontario, California. Now, you may be wondering why an estate planning lawyer is going to be commenting on the 2020 presidential election. Believe it or not, I have no election law experience, so let me make that disclaimer right now. But I have litigated several constitutional cases, particularly First Amendment constitutional cases, and have done several litigations in the federal courts and U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So I kind of know a little bit about the process, and I kind of wanted to explain to you why some of this, maybe some of the reports you're hearing out of the news media might seem a little bit confusing. In fact, I think my sister-in-law on Twitter kind of tweeted out, she didn't understand why people were so mad about people counting the votes. And so it can be a little bit confusing because the Constitution basically gives the control of the elections to individual states. And we'll get to that in a second. But I wanted to first start with the idea, in order to understand what's going on in the U.S. presidential election right now in 2020, I wanted to start with this idea of the United States Constitution and the separation of powers, because far too often we get caught up in these presidential elections and we ignore the fact that a lot of the power of this country is reserved to the states. In fact, the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution reserves all the power that's not vested in the federal government. Everything that's not vested in the federal government by the U.S. Constitution is given to the states to decide. So there's a ton of power that each of the states have. That's why, for example, with the lockdowns, each state has different rules. Lockdowns aren't governed by the President of the United States. Lockdowns are actually governed by the governors of each state. And that's because of the 10th Amendment, because the United States Constitution does not expressly tell the Congress or the President or the Supreme Court that they have the exclusive right to control lockdowns and pandemics. So the states get to choose those kinds of things. Anyway, why am I bringing that up for the 2020 election? Well, in the 2020 election, it's been really close, and we've got, I think the last count was 5 or 4 states outstanding where the vote is still being counted. And we've had Donald Trump come out who claimed victory, and we've had Joe Biden, whose attorney claimed victory. And both sides are very confident in their wins, and both sides are confident that when the votes are done being counted, that they're gonna prevail. But one thing that Donald Trump said and Joe Biden's attorney alluded to was that that there's going to be some challenges in the federal courts about these votes that are being counted. And I think Donald Trump last night even mentioned that the voting has to stop. And so there's been some confusion online and on Twitter and in the media about what's actually happening and why is it that, you went to bed last night with a huge lead for Donald Trump and now maybe Joe Biden's winning, and where are those votes coming from and what's going on? Well, remember the 10th Amendment reserves stuff that's not expressly given to the federal government, to the states. Well, the Constitution does something else. And let me read you here. This is Article 2, Section 1. This is the section of the Constitution that governs the election of the President of the United States. And here's what it says. It says that each state shall appoint in a manner as the legislator thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. Let me kind of decipher that for you. Basically, the election of a U.S. president is governed, the Constitution vests the election of the United States president to the states, and the states, the legislatures of each state, get to decide how their votes, in other words, their electors of the Electoral College, as you know, we're not going to talk about the Electoral College and whether it's a good idea or a bad idea right now. But as you know, no doubt by now, we don't elect presidents by popular vote here. We elect them by the Electoral College. And Article 2, Section 1 states that it's the states that get to decide how their electors are elected. And almost unanimously, the states appoint their electors to the popular vote of that particular state. Nebraska and Maine kind of split the votes in different ways, but we won't get into that. The point that I want to make here is that the state legislatures get to decide how and when and the manner those electors are appointed. Why is that important? That's important because every single state has their own rules for what counts as a valid vote. Every single state has individual rules for how voting will take place and when the voting times and things like that. The only thing that's uniform for electing a president is the day of the election. And that's because Article 2, Section 1 says that the Congress gets to determine the time of the vote. In other words, the date that the vote takes place. But what happens in the states themselves decide. All right. And that's important because every state has different rules. For example, and this is a quick one, this is an easy one to understand. Arizona's polls closed at 7 p.m. Pacific time, but Wisconsin polls closed at 8 p.m. Central time, right? There's no federal law that says, Arizona's right for closing at 7 p.m. and Wisconsin's right or wrong for closing at 8. Instead, the state gets to pick that particular time. And the states also get to pick what counts as a valid vote. And because we've been in a pandemic, a lot of voting took place by mail. And that's not been true in other elections. In other elections, most of the vote took place on election day. But a lot of the vote in this pandemic took place by mail. So the states actually get to regulate what votes count as legal votes. And remember, when we're counting votes, it's only legal votes. Why? Because Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution says that the states get to choose how their electors for the Electoral College are appointed. That's the constitutional role of the states. They get to decide that. So whatever that state says is a legal vote is how that vote will or will not be counted. The upshot of that is the states can have wildly different methods for determining what's a legal vote or not. And I'll give you an example. Let's look at Arizona, for example. In Arizona, the law there is that if you mail in your ballot, you must have mailed in the ballot, or the ballot must have been received by the election officials by 7 p.m. yesterday. That's the rule in Arizona. Makes sense. What does that mean? It means you vote in your mail-in ballot, and you have to have it submitted by November 3rd at 7 p.m. All right? Now, how do you interpret that? Does it mean that it has to be postmarked by November 3rd, or does it have to actually be hand-delivered into the election office? And what happens if someone walks in and hands them the ballot, and as the ballot is going in, it turns 7:01? Is that a legal ballot, or is it an illegal ballot? And so when you hear people talking about, oh, we're going to challenge some of these ballots, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about, are some of these ballots that are being counted, are they legal votes or are they illegal votes? Because if you voted at 7:01 p.m. in Arizona, that's not a legal vote because Arizona says you have to do it before 7 p.m. Now let's contrast that with, for example, North Carolina. North Carolina, the rule there is that the ballot has to be postmarked by November 3rd and received no later than November 12th at 5 p.m. Well, what does that mean? That means that you had to stick your stamp on, well, I'm not sure if North Carolina requires stamps or not. I would be surprised if they did. In California, you didn't have to put a stamp on your ballot. So, in other words, you had to put your ballot in the mailbox on November 3rd. It had to go to the post office and be stamped, postmarked November 3rd. So if you waited till 11:59 p.m. on November 3rd to stick it in the mail, it's probably not a legal vote because it's not going to be tallied until today because the mail didn't pick up at 11:59 p.m. And that's the first requirement. The second requirement is that it has to be received no later than November 12th by 5 p.m. Why is that important? Because if on November 13th, North Carolina gets a batch of ballots, well, those ballots are illegal votes. They cannot be counted in the election. And so when you hear people like maybe Donald Trump, or you hear people in the news media or on Twitter or on Facebook, and they're saying, "Oh, they can't count that vote. That's not they're not able to do that." That's what they're talking about. They're talking about, were those votes legally cast? Were those votes legally authorized by that particular state? And it's confusing because we all live in different states, and the rules in California are different from the rules in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Florida and everywhere else. And so what you're seeing right now in the vote tally, and what the rhetoric that's being kind of talked about, is what are those differences and what kinds of votes are being tallied. Now, I don't know whether this is true or not, but there is some speculation, or at least I've heard some reports, that in Pennsylvania, they're going to allow votes that were postmarked November 3rd, even if they were not received by 8 p.m. And I believe the law in Pennsylvania is that it has to be received by 8 p.m. But at least, and I haven't verified this, so don't quote me, but this is where some of the controversy is coming from, and I want to kind of explain it to you. And so there's a rumor going on that some of those ballots are going to be counted. And so, Donald Trump, for example, is saying, well, those ballots can't be counted. Those aren't legal ballots. Now, the secretaries of state for Pennsylvania, for Michigan, for Wisconsin have all come out, and they've all said that there are no illegal ballots that are being counted. And how do you know that? Well, there's a whole process called canvassing, okay? There's a whole series of things that has to happen before a vote is counted. And one of the things that has to happen, for example, with mail-in ballots, a lot of states require that the mail-in ballots have to be signed by the voter. So again, there's a whole host of other issues where people are receiving mail-in ballots that are unsigned. Well, those are technically illegal votes that can't be counted, and one side or the other might file legal challenges to argue whether or not that vote should or shouldn't be counted, and that's what the fight is right now. But going back to the process, what happens is when a city or a county receives the vote, they have to check it. They check the vote against the listed registered voters in the county to see if that person is registered. They check the signature on the envelope to make sure it matches with the signature that's on record with the registrar of voters. And then and only then do they open up the envelope and then submit it to the vote machines to be tallied. And so there's a whole process to ensure that kind of thing doesn't happen. And in the cases where it has to be postmarked by a certain date, they check to see if it was postmarked. And if not, the votes that are potentially illegal or late would be set aside and not counted, because they know, these states know that there might be legal challenges. And so part of the rhetoric that you hear on Twitter, on Facebook, and things like that arises from people not making the distinction between illegal votes and legal votes. I don't think anyone, Donald Trump included, Joe Biden included, no one right now is saying that legally cast votes should not be counted. The argument, what people are saying, is that if there was a vote that was illegal under that state's law, in other words, something that was turned in today or postmarked too late or submitted too late, those votes are illegal and shouldn't be counted. And that's where the fight is. That's what we're seeing now. But the tally that's currently going on in the states, like in Pennsylvania, Michigan, things like that, that tally is not doesn't involve any of the illegal votes or allegedly illegal votes. That tally is just the mail-in ballot that has been verified to be properly and validly submitted. And the reason it's taking so long is because, as we discussed before, each state has its own rules, not only for what counts as a valid vote, but for how that vote is actually counted. So, for example, in Florida, they had a rule that required that, or that allowed anyway, that the mail-in ballots would be counted. I think they started counting a few days ago, so that on election day they can have an accurate tally of the vote. Well, I believe in Wisconsin, the rule was that they couldn't start opening the mail-in ballots until the day of election. So some of those votes that were mailed in, you can imagine receiving millions and millions of envelopes that have to be cross-checked and verified and things like that. All of that takes extra time, and so that's why you're seeing, the in-person vote that was counted last night, and then at some point the results stopped coming in because you had to have workers opening up envelopes and verifying votes for the mail-in ballot that couldn't be tabulated earlier because of that state's laws. And it's causing a lot of confusion because people are looking at the results and saying, Donald Trump was ahead, now he's behind, they're counting these illegal votes. And right now, the vote that's being counted, or at least what's being reported by the secretaries of states in those states, what's being reported is that the votes being counted are not the controversial votes that were potentially submitted late or could potentially be illegal, but are just the result of a 2020 where a sort of unusual amount of mail-in ballots were received. So I hope that kind of breaks through some of the rhetoric on social media, on Facebook and things like that, where you have these both sides kind of saying there's illegal votes being counted, we should stop counting votes. Nobody is saying we should stop counting properly valid votes. What both sides are saying is that if there were illegal votes, those votes shouldn't count because they're not valid. And depending on who you talk to or who you believe, maybe there's some evidence that the states are counting that and maybe there's not. I'm not going to get into that can of worms. You're free to opine on that. But hopefully what this has done is kind of helped you understand better what those should be. All right, so let's take some questions. If you have any questions on that, let me know. And I've got a question here, and the question reads, so if people dropped off their ballots in a ballot box on the day of election, would that be considered an invalid vote then, or it depends on the state? It would depend on when it was dropped off. Now, I would suspect that the drop-off boxes were all collected at the time the polls closed. But let's just give you a hypothetical here. If, for example, in one of these states where it has to be done by a certain time, when you're dropping off your, in almost every state, when you drop off your ballot, there's a timestamp that the state will put on it so that it can verify when that ballot was dropped off, or not necessarily dropped off, but in the case of a ballot box, when that host of ballot box ballots were received and at what time, so that they can be sure whether or not it's valid. So in answer to your question, if people dropped off their ballots on the ballot box on the day of election before the cutoff time, those ballots should be counted and would be considered valid. If they were dropped off at the ballot box after that time, potentially those votes could be invalid. And it really kind of depends on the state too, because, for example, in California, you don't have to have it be received by a certain date. You just have to have it postmarked. So if it was postmarked on a certain day, then and so long as it's received, I think by the 16th of November, it's still going to be a valid vote. So I would suspect that people who have dropped off things in a ballot box in California, they would have a system to know whether or not that was dropped off on November 3rd, and that vote would likely be counted. But I just don't know enough about individual state laws to answer that. I hope that answers your question. Any other questions? Time to grill a lawyer. No questions at all. Nothing. I must have done a great job then. You must have absolutely no questions about anything, and that makes me happy because an informed social media is frankly a better feed for me to scroll through without seeing people freak out unnecessarily about things that they don't really need to freak out about. Unless there's time to freak out, in which case, by all means, freak out. But as it relates to the counting of votes, nobody is saying we're going to not count valid votes. The argument is what is a valid vote and what's a valid vote in that particular state. And that's what the argument's really about. All right, guys. So thanks for tuning in. I hope this was informative for you, and I hope you know a little bit more about our electoral process and how the president is elected, and know a little bit more about why maybe people are focusing in on the minutia of Pennsylvania and North Carolina and Georgia and all these things that maybe you didn't know about or even want to know about. Now we all know about it because this election is hinging on it turns a few thousand votes in each state. So thank you for everybody who voted. And if you didn't vote, it's too late. We'll see you in 4 years. Have a good one, guys.